So, I've reached the final year of the decade with this series of reviews I'm doing for the 2010s. Now, I think the last video was a bit long, so I'm going to try and make this more condensed, which inevitably means I won't be able to cover everything. There's a few things that define 2019 for me. Number one is, of course, the global climate protests. That really was one of the defining features of that year. Another one is global protests in general, geopolitical protests, social protests. Every year has protests, but 2019 particularly seemed to be a year that some were even calling global spring, and making comparisons to the revolutions and protests of 1989. I think it's not that simple because these protests were for a wide variety of reasons, and although they were worldwide, many of them were different in nature and context. Anyway, without further ado, let's look at the year 2019. Now, before I start off, I'll just make sure I cover these. The Nobel Peace Prize winner, I should say, for the year 2019 was Abiy Ahmed, the Ethiopian Prime Minister, and he got this in recognition of his diplomatic efforts to end the long-standing conflict between Ethiopia and Eritrea, and was much lauded for his efforts, although the country still experiences um, some instability in regions such as Oromo. The two countries, of course, had a bloody border conflict from 1998 to 2000, and most recently in 2016, there were border clashes. So, Nobel Prize winner 2019, Abiy Ahmed. Person of the Year, not surprising, this is from Time magazine, Greta Thunberg, the then 16-year-old teenager who really became not only the most famous teenager in the world that year, but arguably the most famous person in the world in 2019 when she began the school strikes in protest at what she regarded as human inaction on climate change. She famously addressed the UN Assembly. I mean, she was everywhere throughout the year. Um, and a polarizing figure, to her fans, an inspiring teenager to her detractors, a sort of figure of, well, a personality cult, and even as some called her a jumped up brat. But I will continue. I've made my own views on Greta Thunberg clear. Anyway, she was the person of the year, and there were some memorable sort of news events around her, berating the UN, her hovercraft voyage across the Atlantic, and so on. Okay, 2019 saw several high-profile anniversaries and commemorations. 75 years since D-Day landings, the Normandy landings. So it was a big event in France and here in Portsmouth in the UK to commemorate that, including all the major Western world leaders who represented countries directly involved in that. And there was a very poignant play put on in front of the Queen, in front of President Sarkozy, President Trump, Prime Minister May, to demonstrate the event of the Operation Overlord, which was one of the most important military engagements in history and the largest amphibious landing in history. 75 years. All the veterans now, of course, are in their 90s. Another big commemoration in 2019 was 50 years since the moon landing, since Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins made that famous Apollo 11 trip to the moon. There was some commemoration for this, including two feature films. First Man, starring Ryan Gosling as Neil Armstrong, and the real-time documentary, real-time as it was filmed in 1969, Apollo 11, which was superb. So there's a lot of focus on space aviation in 2019. And the other big anniversary was 30 years since Tiananmen Square. Um, so there were some commemorations for that, but that year they were overshadowed by the ongoing crisis in Hong Kong, which I will address later in the video. One more anniversary, big one off the top of my head. Exactly 100 years since the Treaty of Versailles, which ended World War One formally. The armistice had been in 1918, but the war formally ended in 1919, so 100 years since that. Here in the UK, it was 30 years since many big disasters in this country, such as the Hillsborough disaster, among others. Okay, so to continue, I'm just gonna how I'm gonna do this is gonna scan through the Wikipedia list. I'm gonna really resist the temptation to read out every single thing, because it would just take too long. So we'll try and sort of scan this as best as possible. So, um, and not include absolutely everything. By the way, I should say one of the big events of 2018, which I should have probably mentioned, the Mexican presidential election. The left-wing Luis Manuel Obrador became Mexico's president, the first left-winger in decades, affectionately nicknamed AMLO. And there was a lot of discussion over how would he relate to Donald Trump, what would the status of immigration between the two countries be, and so on. Um, okay, so moving into 2019. Qatar withdrew from OPEC. This was an ongoing part of the tensions that Qatar was facing from its regional neighbours. Same-sex marriage became legal, in Austria on January the 1st. The Chinese probe China 4 became the first human-made object to land on the far side of the moon. I remember being in China when that happened. It was a big story there, naturally. A faction of the armed forces of Gabon announced a coup d'etat, which was quickly put down with just two deaths, a country that had long seen political instability. Venezuela entered a constitutional crisis as Juan Guaido and the National Assembly declared incumbent President Nicolas Maduro illegitimate and started the process of attempting to remove him. Later in the year, Maduro removed the Colombian ambassador, or rather severed ties with Colombia and with the United States. Venezuela continued to go through a humanitarian crisis. People weren't having access. I talk in the past context, of course, this is still ongoing. Don't have access to medicine. There was a major food shortage in supermarkets, and basically the world found itself choosing one side or the other, with most democracies, including most South and Central American countries, backing Guaido, whereas most single party states, such as China, backing Nicolas Maduro. So all eyes were on Venezuela in the first half of 2019. And part of this was a prison massacre in which some 29 people were killed. So ongoing crisis in that country. On January the 17th, a bomb attack took place in Bogota, Colombia, which killed some 22 people and injured 68, making it the deadliest attack on the Colombian capital since 2003, and a blow for the peace process that had been going on in that country, with most of the major rebel groups having laid down their arms. So that was an unfortunate incident in what had otherwise been a forward step in Colombia. On January the 18th, fuel thieves ruptured a pipeline in Tlalquilpan, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, Mexico, and the subsequent explosion killed some 137 people. A major earthquake in Chile caused a power blackout with some 200,000 people left without power. Um, and just continuing, a major dam disaster took place in the Brazilian city of Brumadinho in the state of Minas Gerais. At least 248 people were killed, with many missing. The US Justice Department confirmed that the Chinese tech giant Huawei charged the Chinese tech giant Huawei with multiple counts of fraud, raising US China tensions. That's another major defining event of the year 2019, was the US China trade war. And as there had been tensions between Russia and the West in 2018, we now saw tensions between China and the West in 2019. Um, on February the 1st, President Trump announced the US will leave the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty of 1987, citing Russian non-compliance. Pope Francis became the first Catholic pope to visit the Arabian Peninsula when he visited Abu Dhabi in the United Arab Emirates. The insurgency in Afghanistan continued. The Taliban killed 47 people in attacks while Afghan Taliban peace talks were taking place in Moscow. The Freedom House organization stated that Hungary was no longer a free country, making it the first country in the EU to be labelled as partly free. It also stated that neighbouring Serbia was no longer a free country as well. Protests broke out in Haiti against the President Jovenel Moise. A suicide bombing took place in southern Iran, killing 27 Revolutionary Guards in one of the deadliest terrorist attacks in that country for some time. A major attack took place against Indian security personnel in Indian administered Kashmir, killing 40 and provoking a crisis between India and Pakistan, which culminated in fears of all out war and a high profile exchange with an Indian army major who was hailed a national hero. And all the major networks covered that. I remember watching it at the time. A major fire broke out in Dhaka, Bangladesh, killing 78 people. The Nigerian general election took place for the presidency. All 360 seats in the House of Representatives and 110 seats in the Senate were up for grabs, and President Muhammadu Buhari secured victory. Um, in Cairo, Egypt, a major railway disaster took place at the Ramesses railway station when a train ploughed into the platform, killing some 25 people. The second North Korea United States summit was held in Hanoi, Vietnam, between Donald Trump and Chairman Kim Jong un. The Estonian parliamentary election took place. Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302, a Boeing 737 MAX 8 bound for Nairobi, crashed shortly after takeoff from Addis Ababa, killing some 157 people on board. And this meant that all Boeing 737 MAX aircraft were grounded and led to a major inquiry over safety at the company. This was on top of a similar disaster in Indonesia in 2018. 51 people were killed in New Zealand's worst ever terrorist attack targeting the Muslim community. Shootings took place at two mosques in Christchurch by the Australian national Brenton Tarrant, and Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern called it one of New Zealand's darkest days. Cyclone Idai made landfall in Mozambique, causing over 1,000 fatalities and mass flooding, and was the worst tropical cyclone in the southern hemisphere for many years. Okay, a major explosion at a chemical plant in Jiangshui, Jiangsu, China killed 78 people and injured more than 600 others. The final territory of the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, located in al-Baghdus Fakhani, Syria, is liberated. Some 400,000 people marched in London in protest against Brexit, and this was followed by a large pro Brexit rally. So, this demonstrated the tensions and the divisions that are in this country over Brexit. The 2019 Thai general election took place for all 500 seats in the House of Representatives. Robert Mueller's report into Russian interference in the 2016 US election took place, which is published by the US Attorney General William Barr. It concludes that there is no collusion with Russia, the basis of the investigation, but on the issue of obstruction of justice said the report does not conclude that the president committed a crime, but nor does it exonerate him. And of course, later in the year, a full-on impeachment process led by the Democrats took place against President Trump, becoming only the third president after Andrew Johnson and Bill Clinton to be impeached in American history. Taiwan scrambled its jets after Chinese jets crossed the maritime border between the two nations, and the day before, Japan had similarly scrambled jets with Chinese landing Chinese jets in their airspace. In Algeria, Abdel Aziz Bouteflika resigned as president amid widespread protests after nearly 2 decades in office. The second Libyan civil war continued with a surprise offensive in western Libya by the Libyan National Army towards the Government of National Accord. And the LNA said that the operation ordered by General Khalifa Haftar is aimed at cleansing the western zone from terrorist groups. The Israeli legislative election took place in the Knesset. Fossil fragments in the Callao cave in the Philippines revealed the existence of the Homo luzonensis species of humans. On the same day, April the 10th, the Event Horizon Telescope project announced the first ever image of a black hole. WikiLeaks co-founder Julian Assange was arrested after 7 years in the Ecuadorian embassy in London. Amid mass protests in Sudan, the long-standing dictator Omar al-Bashir is deposed in a coup d'etat after nearly 30 years in power. And this was seen as the Sudan uh, major a major stepping stone in the Sudan Revolution of 2019. And there were many defining images of this. One of them was the so-called Nubian Queen, the young woman that made a rousing speech to protesters in Khartoum. And although there was an awful prison massacre in June, a massacre in June, over 100 people killed, which led to Sudan being suspended from the African Union and showing that even with Bashir gone, the country was still not a democracy. It's definitely on an upward trajectory with Islamist era laws um, brought down, and also the movement was very much led by women. So those are some notable events of the Sudan Revolution of 2019. During Holy Week, a major fire engulfed the Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, causing substantial damage, the collapse of the main spire, and led many to make donations. This was, of course, a great landmark of the city of Paris. The Indonesian general election took place, as well as the Indian general election, both April 2019, the first stages. In India, Narendra Modi was victorious, being the landslide victory for him. And in Indonesia, Joko Widodo resumed his tenure as president. So, two very populous countries, India, the most populous democracy in the world, leading a resounding victory for Narendra Modi. So 29 people were killed in a bus crash on the Portuguese island of Madeira. A series of bombing attacks occurred in Sri Lanka on April the 21st, killing some 259 people, and an affiliate of Islamic State claimed responsibility. And this was the deadliest attack in the country since the civil war ended in 2009. Comedian Volodymyr Zelensky was elected president of Ukraine the same month, the same day, in fact. Um, North Korean leader Kim Jong un visited Russia in a series of summits. Avengers Endgame became the highest grossing film ever, beating Titanic and Avatar, breaking many box office records. Emperor Akihito of Japan abdicated from the throne, the first abdication by a Japanese monarch in almost 2 centuries. The abdication ends the Heisei or the Heisei era of Japan. Apologies if I'm pronouncing anything wrong. And ushered in the Reiwa era with new Emperor Naruhito ascending the throne on the 1st of May. Likewise, King Vajiralongkorn of Thailand was formally crowned in 2019, having assumed the throne in 2016. The Kivu Ebola virus continued with over 1,000 fatalities in 2019. By May the 3rd, I should say. The Syrian army launched a major ground offensive against one of the last rebel strongholds in the country on May the 6th. Amid ongoing negotiations, the United States' 25% tariff hike on $200 billion worth of Chinese imports takes effect, escalating tensions in the US-China trade war. 2019 is also a year where, like I say, China-West tensions really escalated. This was in part because of the detainment of three Canadians on dubious charges in China and the arrest of the daughter of the Huawei president in Vancouver, Canada, leading also to tensions between Canada and China. So this was very much like the tensions between Russia and the West in 2018. Like I say, it was between Russia and China in 2019, particularly between China and Britain over the Hong Kong crisis. May was the Gulf of Oman incident when several oil tankers belonging to Saudi Aramco were damaged in the port of Harajah in the Gulf of Oman, with Iran being blamed. The Philippine general election took place for all 297 seats in the House of Representatives. Taiwan became the first country in Asia to legalize same-sex marriage. The 2019 Eurovision Song Contest took place in Tel Aviv, Israel. In the Australian federal election, Scott Morrison was victorious, narrowly re-elected. Um, and Botswana lifted its 5-year prohibition on elephant hunting. Theresa May made a tearful announcement that she was stepping down as Conservative leader and Prime Minister. This paved the way for the Conservative leadership contest, which culminated between Jeremy Hunt and Boris Johnson. It had been a very crowded field in the beginning, and eventually Boris Johnson came in as Britain's 55th Prime Minister. Several bloody prison riots took place in South America. In Brazil, more than 50 were killed. In Ararica, Venezuela, some 29 killed. Donald Trump became the first foreign leader to meet with Japanese Emperor Naruhito. The Cricket World Cup was held in England and Wales and was won by England. After nearly 5 years after abdication, King Juan Carlos I of Spain retired from public life. Chinese President Xi Jinping made a state visit to Russia, where he also attended the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum. The Danish general election took place for all 179 seats in the Folketing. Hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. The 2019 FIFA Women's World Cup was held in France and was won by the United States. June the 9th, the Hong Kong anti-extradition bill protests broke out. Some 1 million people protested in Hong Kong against this controversial extradition bill brought in by Chief Executive Carrie Lam. And this was over fear that this extradition bill would be used as an excuse to hand over dissenters to China. And it marked the largest protest in Hong Kong since the 1997 handover, and an ongoing crisis which has not really been resumed since. Also, significant tensions between the United Kingdom and China, which came all the way to university campuses here in the UK. I'll very much remember this as being much as there was a great outshow of nationalism in China in 2008 at the time of the Beijing Olympics. Nothing like that since. The events of 2019 really reminded me of that, with even exchanges and threats of harassment between mainland Chinese students and Hong Kong students on British campuses, and also so-called Defend My Flag campaign by Chinese state media. So really, it was a year marked by serious crisis in Hong Kong. But perhaps even more poignant was the ongoing reports of the concentration camps in Xinjiang and the persecution of Chinese Uyghur Muslims. And shamefully, a number of Asian countries signed a letter actually condoning China's behavior, but this led to basically allegations of the worst level of persecution since the Second World War against Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang. June the 14th, Jane Goodall, British primatologist, was awarded the 2019 Luxembourg Prize for Outstanding Environmental Peace. Continuing throughout the year, the Boko Haram insurgency continued in Nigeria, with 30 people killed on June the 17th in Borno, Nigeria. Then, if we just continue throughout the year, on June the 22nd, coup d'etat was attempted in the Amhara region of Ethiopia, with Regional President Ambachu Mekonnen and National Military Chief of Staff Seare Mekonnen were assassinated. A trilateral meeting took place at the Panmunjom Truce Village between South Korean President Moon Jae-in, North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, and the United States President Donald Trump. And Trump became the first sitting US president to cross the Korean demilitarized zone and enter North Korea, albeit for a brief period. So quite a historic movement. Japan resumed commercial whaling controversially after a 30-year moratorium following its withdrawal from the International Whaling Commission. A fire on the Russian deep-sea submarine Noach Arik killed 14 crew members. Submarine commander Denis Dolonsky was among those killed. A total solar eclipse occurred over South America. On July the 3rd, a terrible airstrike took place in the Tajora migrant center in Libya, killing some 53 people. The Greek legislative election took place. The last Volkswagen Beetle rolls off the line in Puebla, Mexico. The last of the 5,961 special edition cars will be exhibited in a museum. Hurricane Barry struck the Gulf Coast, killing one and causing over $500 million in damage. Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, former head of the Sinaloa cartel in the Mexican drug war, is sentenced to life in prison plus 30 years. 36 people were killed in an arson attack at an animation company in Kyoto, and this was one of the deadliest massacres in Japan in modern times, in fact, since World War II. Tensions in the Gulf continue with the Iranian Navy of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard capturing the British tanker Stena Imperial and temporarily seizing the British-operated and Liberian-flagged tanker Mesdar in the Persian Gulf. The British Foreign Secretary Jeremy Hunt warned there will be serious consequences if Iran does not release the tanker. A mob of 100 suspected triad members attacked protesters at the Yuandong station in Hong Kong, injuring 45, including a pregnant woman and a pro-democracy legislator. Boris Johnson on July the 24th officially became Britain's 55th Prime Minister. July the 26th to August the 11th, the 2019 Pan American Games are held in Lima, Peru. Danish Polar Research Institution Polar Portal reports a large spike in Greenland ice loss, with 11 billion tons melted in one day. Also that year, Donald Trump erroneously tried to buy Greenland, which he was rebuked. The South Korea-Japan trade dispute broke out. Japan announced the removal of South Korea from its list of most trusted trading partners. A mass shooting took place in El Paso, Texas, leaving 22 dead and 24 injured. And on the same 24-hour period, 10 people were killed in Dayton, Ohio, in another mass shooting, once again provoking a robust debate on American gun politics. And I'm just trying to be selective as much as possible here. The Morogoro tanker explosion, a fuel tanker explosion, occurred in Morogoro, Tanzania, killing some 89 people. Severe floods broke out in India, killing 114 people at least in the initial outbreak of floods. Russian airstrikes killed some 20 civilians at the Has refugee camp in Syria. Papua New Guinea experienced protests mainly across Indonesian Papua, across the Papua region, in response to an incident in Surabaya where a group of Papuan students were arrested for allegedly disrespecting the Indonesian flag. German Chancellor Angela Merkel and French President Emmanuel Macron described the ongoing widespread Amazon fires as an international emergency, urging the matter to be discussed at the weekend's G7 summit. Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro angrily told them to mind their own business instead of internal affairs. This was one of the defining events of, like I say, climate was very much in the news in 2019. So the Amazon wildfires of that year very much were shocking to many across the world. Hurricane Dorian made landfall in the Bahamas. 43 deaths are reported, with others reported to be missing. 34 people were killed with the sinking of MV Concepcion off the coast of California, and it's the worst maritime disaster in California in more than 150 years. With the Afghan peace process, President Donald Trump called off planned peace talks with the Taliban at Camp David after they claimed responsibility for the September 2nd and 5th bombings in Kabul, which killed a US soldier, among others. The Parliament of the United Kingdom is controversially prorogued by Boris Johnson amid unprecedented protests from opposition MPs who hold up signs in the House of Commons and refuse to back the shutdown. A gas explosion occurred in Novosibirsk Oblast, setting off fires in bioweapons plants that house viruses including smallpox, Ebola, and anthrax. 30 Afghan nut farmers are killed and 40 injured in a US drone attack in Nangarhar province. Supreme Court of the United Kingdom ruling found that the September 2019 prorogation of Parliament was unlawful and void. And one of the world's oldest and largest travel firms, Thomas Cook, went bankrupt as last-minute rescue negotiations failed, stranding some 600,000 tourists worldwide. Russia formally adopted the Paris Climate Agreement. 70th anniversary of the People's Republic of China on October the 1st. Major demonstrations, major commemorations took place across the country, but it was very much overshadowed in Hong Kong by the ongoing protests there. On the same day, a protester was shot in the chest with live ammunition and critically injured. Um, just continuing throughout 2019, the Portuguese legislative election took place. There were ongoing protests in Iraq and Iran, with hundreds killed in the crackdowns there, I should say. Ecuador also saw protests break out on October the 8th. The government of Ecuador, headed by President Lenin Moreno, moved to Guayaquil as the Carondelet Palace in Quito is overtaken by protesters. Extinction Rebellion staged protests throughout the year 2019. Their activism was very polarizing to much of the British public, with many finding it to be incredibly disruptive and selfish, whereas others said that this was necessary to bring awareness of climate change. Turkish offensive into northeast Syria occurred on October the 9th. Um, Typhoon Hagibis made landfall in Japan. The Polish parliamentary elections took place on October the 13th. Shootouts emerged in Culiacan, Mexico after the arrest of El Chapo's son, Ovidio Guzman Lopez. 8 people were killed and 56 convicts escaped. Riots in the Chilean capital of Santiago broke out as civil unrest escalated across the country in reaction to a series of economic measures and government declarations labelled as abuse of power by protesters. Uh, Following the Bolivian general election, Evo Morales defeated his nearest rival by 10%, but after multiple allegations of irregularities, um, clear manipulations of Bolivia's voting system were found, and a political crisis broke out in Bolivia. An estimated 1 million people marched through London in a protest organised by the People's Vote to demand a second referendum on Brexit. Also here in the UK, some 39 migrants from Vietnam were discovered in a lorry container in Essex. A 25-year-old man from Northern Ireland was arrested on suspicion of murder. Tourists visit the summit of Uluru for the last time as a ban on climbing the famous rock in Australia's Northern Territory came into effect. The Uruguayan general election took place on October the 27th. And I'm going to round this up fairly soon. The Barham family massacre. 9 Americans are killed when Mexican gang members opened fire on the vehicles while driving to a wedding about 70 miles south of the Mexico-US border. Amnesty International alleges that Bangladesh killed some 466 people in 2018 under the guise of an anti-drugs campaign in what appeared to be a wave of extrajudicial killings. The United States formally begins its process to pull out of the Paris Climate Agreement. Terrorist atrocity took place at the Fada Ngormo attack in Burkina Faso, owned by a Canadian gold mining company. The Supreme Court of India awards a holy site in Ayodhya, Uttar Pradesh to Hindus, rejecting the Muslim claim. The move is likely to spur sectarian disputes. And also in the background, there was controversial citizenship laws that were brought in by Narendra Modi, with many alleging that Modi was behaving as a dictator, with his supporters, of course, refuting this. Let's see. Public impeachment hearings took place against President Donald Trump. Italy declared a state of emergency with severe flooding in Venice. An independence referendum began in Bougainville, Papua New Guinea. The last known Sumatran rhinoceros in Malaysia dies. The World Meteorological Organization reported that levels of heat-trapping greenhouse gases in the atmosphere have reached another record high of 407 0.8 parts per million. A major earthquake occurred in Albania, killing 51 people in the deadliest earthquake of that year. Um, the 2019 Southeast Asian Games were held in the Philippines. A major landslide took place in Burundi in December, killing 26 people. A fire at a factory in India that month killed some 43 people. The World Anti-Doping Agency on December the 9th voted unanimously to ban Russia from international sport for 4 years for doping offences, meaning it will be excluded from the 2020 Summer Olympics this year in Tokyo. A volcano erupted in White Island in New Zealand, killing some 20 people and injuring 27 others. Sanna Marin, at the age of 34, became the world's youngest serving prime minister after being selected to lead Finland's Social Democratic Party. The World Trade Organization is left unable to intervene in trade disputes after the US blocked the appointment of new panel members. On December the 12th, the United Kingdom saw a general election, the first Christmas general election in almost 100 years, in which Boris Johnson's Conservatives won a majority, defeating Jeremy Corbyn's Labour. Shandong, China's first fully domesticated built aircraft carrier, enters naval service. And just trying to skim through this as much as possible. I've already went well over the time the time I'd intended. Earlier in the year, I should say that two notable deaths. One was of ISIS leader Abu Baghdadi. Abu al-Baghdadi, I should say, was killed in a US operation in Syria. Then we have, this is definitely way too long, I just know that already. A truck bomb attributed to Al Shabaab exploded in Mogadishu, killing some 78 people. Former president of Peru, Alan Garcia, died from suicide following his indictment in the Odebrecht scandal in Peru and in Brazil. And on the last day of the year, Iraqi militiamen and protesters breached the front gate checkpoint of the United States Embassy in Baghdad following a US military operation targeting an Iraqi militia backed by Qasem Soleimani in Iraq. So that concludes 2019. Right, I know this is way too long. I guess I'll be lucky if I get 10 views for this one, but I've done it now. That was the year 2019, and that concludes my series of reviews of the 2010s. I'll be making a sort of general view of the 2010s decade, but there we go. That was the year 2019.